what I have to talk about, unfortunately, probably doesn't sit quite as nicely as what we've been talking about earlier. Swarin's conversations, particularly, really, he's a great conversationalist, and I've known Swarin quite a while, and Lisa's extraordinary gift at giving us an insight into her world. I mean, very hard to follow those two things, because what I'm talking about is so boring in comparison. Anyway. I was asked to actually talk about the gap between research and practice. So I had a little think about that, and it was in the session, in this particular session on transitions. So I had to think about, okay, where are we going to go with this? What is important for us as a community? Now, when I talk about some of the things here, you're going to think, we do that. We all do that. We're all on the same page. But I would argue we're not, because I'm going to maybe talk a little bit about where I see research as having one agenda, practitioners and maybe healthcare having another agenda, and sometimes these things aren't aligned. And often, although we actually have young people at the core of what we do, because we have different agendas, often going in different directions, we don't pull enough on that shared experience so that we actually come to, as Swarin said at the end, he didn't have a solution. I'm going to say I don't have a solution either, but I do think as a community we have a responsibility to think about where we're going with research and practice. So that's where I am. Oh, I was supposed to take this moving object. Okay. Sorry. Does this? Maybe it doesn't work. Oh, there it is. Okay, so first thing I'm going to say, is there a problem? Do we have a problem? Are we all aligned? Is the research agenda and the practitioners' agenda, the government agenda, the editors and the journals' agenda, are all these agendas the same? I would argue that they're not. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the drivers behind these agendas and maybe how some of these agendas get set, and how, when we set these agendas, we may not necessarily be serving is the wrong word, being involved in the right solution for the mental health of young people. And I think this agenda applies to this form of youth mental health, but I think it applies to any form. You can pick any form and it is the same. Okay, so just look at some of these drivers. We have academics, practitioners, funders, government, young people, community, health services, journals. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these. So if we take academics. So most academics, if they're based in a university setting, some academics are lucky enough to be based not just in an academic setting, but also in a setting such as Origin, which is really looking at evolving evidence-based practice. But the majority of us that are actually working in the area and working closely with practitioners are often focused and located within an academic institution. And the academic drivers in that institution drive our agenda in many cases. And if you are a young researcher in an academic institution, in general, you will aspire to do well, to be promoted, and often the university will have an agenda as how that will happen. It will happen if you get money, if you supervise, and if you have journals published in if you have articles published in high impact journals, which is quite difficult. And many of us know, I'll get to journals in a little while, if you're writing a journal article, you may have done a phenomenal piece of research, but then when you go to write it up, the first thing we do is we go and we consult the journal. We find out what the journal guidelines are. It tells us how long it can be. It can tell us how many tables we have, what format we do, and exactly all the different categories and sections that are to be in that journal. Now, I'm not dismissing the evidence base in journals. I'm just saying that these are different agendas. Also, if we think about when we have how we write within that paper is often not very consumable by others outside our field. I know if I read a paper that's very biologically based, I may struggle to understand. I'll read the introduction, I'll be okay with that. I'll flick to the methodology because I mightn't understand that. I'll get to the conclusions and I'll read that. But I may actually pick that up as actual evidence, but because I can't read the bit in the middle, I might draw the wrong conclusions. Equally, if we publish data like that and we don't consider how that might be useful for community, young people, practitioners, we're actually missing the opportunity to actually triangulate all of this information. When we look at people who work in practice, many people innovate every single day in practice. They tweak something, they think something, they try something new. Sometimes they'll do small pieces of research within their practice, they'll collect some evidence base. But often that evidence doesn't get shared beyond maybe that particular area because it doesn't meet the criteria of more methodologically sound research that others of us may be actually looking at. And I think we have a huge lost opportunity there where people are innovating all the time and we don't always get to hear about it. So in a way, in terms of moving forward, how do we try and join up some of this thinking? Funders. And not all funding, but I just went back and looked at some recent calls here in Ireland, and if you are looking for funding as, say, a PI, an investigator, a principal investigator, they'll often look at your track record before they'll actually think you can actually be a good researcher or not. And that's often quite hard to do. So there is already a bias in terms of who the money will go to because you have to have this track record done. And I do understand from a funder's perspective, it's very important that they invest in high quality, good research. So I'm not dismissing it, I'm just saying there are agendas there when we're looking at that. The Irish Research Council has calls at the moment for postgraduate scholarships, and I was trying to recall the last time I was involved. I know there's impact written in there somewhere. So I went back and I had a look, and yes, impact is there, but really their definition of impact was conferences, publications and things like that, not actually had the research any impact beyond what was actually being done. And then we've government. So in terms of when we're looking at government, often a government will have their own agenda, and the agenda of government may not be aligned with what we're doing. And often we had an excellent junior minister for mental health recently, who was very strongly on her agenda, and at a time when we had a task force, and many of us in this room here had an imprint into a task force on mental health. At the time when this task force was gathering its evidence as to where we should be moving as a country, we had a change in terms of our minister. And I'm not saying our new junior minister wasn't actually aligned to the vision, but because they're new, it was kind of disruptive right at that particular time. So all of these are feeding into the agenda. Young people. I'm going to run out of time, and I thought I'd have no time. Young people themselves, and it's very interesting. They are key to what we do. And we had a very interesting workshop yesterday on doing research differently. And Magenta Simmons and Marianne Davis were fantastic in guiding that yesterday. And how we actually engage young people right from the get-go in terms of co-design in our research agenda. And some of the questions that came from the floor, which actually got me thinking, was, for example, what do we do? How do we ensure that we have a broad voice of young people as part of our design? If we have a certain group of young people, they too can actually shift the agenda. Whereas if you have a broad base, you can really begin to see, well, what is the broad perspective here? So again, there's agenda in that. And our community, again, when we look at those, and our health services, all of these are very important pieces in a puzzle of trying to understand what is best and what might work. I think, Swaran, you talked about, was it the NICE guidelines, what would work, etc., by gathering the evidence. And again, that's the point, is what might work. But often we have to get all of these pieces aligned before we actually may have a better understanding of what might work. And journals certainly are in terms of publishing in journals, when you look at the criteria and what is to be published, often non-significant results are not published. For those of us who aren't researchers, that means we didn't find an effect. But sometimes those outcomes are as important as an effect, because it actually tells us, maybe that's a road we shouldn't go down. Let's go try another road. So these are really important. Some journals are now more and more looking at evidence that's suggestive of non-significant findings. But sometimes the highest impact journals, the ones that people want to be in, that high impact factor, they're the journals that actually often don't take this type of research. Okay, so impact, how do we know it happens? This is something I was, like all of the universities, the research excellence framework in the UK are all now looking at the impact of research that's been done within our institutions. How do we know it happens? So we may say we have impact, but how do you actually document and evaluate impact? And that came up at our workshop yesterday. It's extremely difficult to do. I was looking at the reading Nature last night, which looked at the outcome from the first Research Excellence Framework in the UK, 2014. And there were 6,000 cases, or more than 6,000 cases of impact delivered by the universities. And there was an analysis done of that. And the analysis came to the conclusion, it was done at the Institute of Policy in King's, that 50% of the impact studies that were evidenced within the university had a direct impact on government in the UK. So I had to question, well, what is that impact? What does that mean? So I do think we were struggling with impact. And also, I think, asking the question, is there a failure to share research finding with those in practice and policy roles? I think we often have research here, practice here, and then over there we have practice and policy, our policy, and how we try to join up those two things. Now, are there other models we can use? And this one is the knowledge transfer and exchange model. And so now I'll have a little look at some other models and where are these working? And do we have an evidence that in the area of youth mental health that this type of model is working? Now, I do know that there's quite a bit of dissemination work being done in Canada and in other countries. So I'm not suggesting it's not done at all. I just don't think we do it enough. So looking at the knowledge transfer and exchange model, there are the stakeholders in a model like this are knowledge generators, such as the researchers, the knowledge users, the knowledge beneficiaries. But in each case, again, we have to look at who's setting the agenda. Where in this process did the agenda get set? And that often will determine where the research is going to go. So we have to be very careful and very mindful. And I actually think this is a very good model, but I often think as getting that balance right, again, we need to look at that. A colleague of mine in UCD has they're just publishing a paper looking at knowledge transfer and exchange. And they looked at papers back between 1989 and 2014, and 79 papers met the criteria of a KTE paper. And when they looked into that, and I had a look at the data, 2 were linked to psychiatry, 2 were linked to psychology, 1 was linked to an adolescent sample, and 3 papers referred to mental health. So this is an area that is about exchanging knowledge, creating knowledge together, where you have your generators, your beneficiaries, etc., and your users all involved. And yet, like psychiatry and psychology, and this area has actually very little reference in that space. One could argue, well, maybe that's not a space for us. I'm just questioning, why aren't we in that space? Then the university perspective. Now, this is a model taken from University College Dublin, and it was based on their impact journey for the research in the institution, and it's across time. So we have inputs, research funding, researchers, existing knowledge, facilities and equipment. We have activities, our methods, our collaboration, learning, training, and then we have our outputs, publications, prototypes, artifacts, etc. And then further out, we have citations, licenses, etc. And the furthest out here is the economy, society, and education. Where do you think the majority of academic researchers kind of end their journey? Outputs. Yeah. In general, often, if the research meets the needs of the academic by getting good citations, they will often end there and then move on to the next piece of research. And often the feedback loop never happens. So although the universities will say, yes, we're on that impact agenda, I would argue not necessarily. Okay, and again, this is another way of looking at impact. So again, within our institution, we make the distinction between academic and economic and societal impact. So we say impact is 2 areas. We have the academic and we have the economic and the societal. Again, where's the evidence that we actually get to economic and societal? I think we are pretty clear how we can actually identify whether we meet the academic, but I think we have very poor evidence when we're actually meeting the economic and societal. And I think we have a lot of work. I actually think this type of forum, when you think about this, is the 4th conference that we have. It brings together researchers, active researchers. It brings together practitioners. It brings together young people. It brings together families. It brings together people working in the health area for youth mental health. We as a community have the best possible opportunity to actually make this work, a lot better than other areas, and I think we have a responsibility to actually make this work. So, and I asked the question, are these research models compatible, and can we measure impact? I think at the moment, I don't say they're incompatible, but they are not aligned. And I think what we need to do is get these two things aligned. And if we do, I think we will get impact, and I think we will be able to measure. So, I think we need to move beyond publication. I think we all understand that that's not a metric necessarily for good research. We do need to try and maximize our impact based on where I think we should be going. And because I was doing loads of Googling and thinking, oh my God, what am I going to say, what am I going to say? This is not really this isn't my space. And I had, of course, came across Pat, as usual, when I was doing my searching. And I came with Pat said this 2017 at the SCOP conference when he was being interviewed. If I take a look now at all the evidence that is on the table now, it is high time we do something with it and bring it to the real world. So he's actually saying something the same, that we have evidence, but we're not actually translating that evidence in a way that has meaning for the young people that actually we are so passionate about. Thank you.